Yes.
Okay. Welcome everyone to this month's episode of our Everyday Environment webinars. If some of you have joined us for some of the others, welcome back. For those of you that are new, I'm sure you're going to find a very informative presentation today. I do want to ask that everyone please make sure that they have their videos off so that we have plenty of bandwidth to work with today. And I want to go ahead and introduce Dr. Ashley Belle. Dr. Belle is an environmental educator working in Christian, Macoupin, Jersey, and Montgomery counties. And she's going to be talking today about waste to renewable energy. If you have any questions during the presentations, feel free to put those in the chat box. We'll have enough time at the end of the presentation that we will go through those questions as they appear. And with that, Dr. Belle, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Dwayne. So thank you so much for attending today's webinar focused on converting organic waste materials into renewable energy using anaerobic digestion technology. So this webinar is a part of the Everyday Environment webinar series, and it has been green certified through the Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment's Certified Greener Campus program. So the University of Illinois is striving to become carbon neutral by 2050, and so we are committed to increasing public awareness about sustainability. So some actions that we have taken today to be certified as a green event include offering this program virtually and going paperless. So small actions, they really can make a big difference when many of us choose to do them. So in order to learn more about the university's campus sustainability efforts, as well as actions that you can take to become more sustainable, we're going to put the link to the Institute's website in our chat box. So before we get started, I want to launch another poll. And can you tell me what motivated you to attend today's webinar? And select the best response that describes your current knowledge of anaerobic digestion technology. So on question 1, if you select other, please tell me in the chat box, further explain your answer for me. Okay, thank you for responding. So before we jump into learning about how anaerobic digestion technology works, let's kind of look at some terminology first. So let's look here at the term anaerobic. So you can see that it contains the word aerobic, and aerobic itself means oxygen rich, whereas anaerobic means oxygen free or having an oxygen depleted environment. And then we have microbial process. So when you think about microbial processes, just think about that means that it involves tiny living organisms like bacteria or archaea. Those are involved in the digestion process. So when you think about anaerobic digestion, it is a microbial-based process in which organic waste like manures, food waste, or crop residues, they're broken down, they're decomposed in this oxygen-free environment to produce methane-enriched biogas that can be used as a renewable form of energy. So let's kind of break this down here. We have our anaerobic digester here. This is our vessel where the digestion is going to occur. This is our oxygen-free environment. So when we place organic materials like our livestock manure, our food waste into this digester, those microbes are going to break it down, decompose it, and generate methane-enriched biogas that is captured. So the composition of your biogas can vary depending upon the feedstocks here that you're actually digesting. But typically, this biogas is going to consist of primarily methane and between 30 to 40% carbon dioxide, with trace amounts of other gases like hydrogen sulfide and ammonia, along with a very small percentage of water vapor. So before we do that, let me go back to this picture here and talk about this biogas that we have captured. So with this biogas that we have captured, we can actually use that as a fuel. So we can use that as a fuel for, say, boilers or furnaces. And that's that biogas that can be used to, say, heat buildings or, say, heat water. And then that captured biogas can also be used to generate electricity. And that's electricity that can be used on site for, say, lighting buildings or, say, even cooling milk at a dairy, or that electricity could be sold to the electric grid. Now, remember I said that biogas contains some other impurities? So that biogas can be cleaned and upgraded, leaving behind just methane, and it can be sold to the natural gas pipeline, or that methane can be compressed for vehicle fuel. Okay, so with anaerobic digestion, there are multiple applications that can be used here. So it can be used at a smaller scale, like a household digester. It can be used to divert food waste from being disposed of at a landfill. Also, it can be used at a wastewater treatment plant, as well as to handle those manures or crop residues at livestock facilities. So I want to point out that even though the design of the anaerobic digester may vary depending upon what you want to digest, those same microbial-based processes that are responsible for producing that methane gas still occur. So let's take a closer look at some of these applications. So in a developing country, you may find a small scale anaerobic digester in someone's backyard. So they may own a few cows, and so within their digester here, they may say digest the manure from the few cows or the few pigs that they may have, as well as any food scraps that they may have. And they may produce enough biogas to, say, maybe prepare 1 or 2 meals with daily. And since biogas has a lower energy density, a lower heating value in comparison to natural gas, which is made up of primarily methane, you may notice that the orifice on where the biogas comes out is different. It's a little bit larger. Now, due to its organic content, anaerobic digestion has also been used as a method for diverting food waste from the landfill. So if we take a look at this particular graph here, we can see that in 2017, about 268 million tons of municipal solid waste was generated in the US. So when I'm talking about municipal solid waste, that's just the non-liquid waste materials that comes from places like our homes, our schools, hospitals, as well as small businesses. So of that municipal solid waste that was generated, we can see that food waste here was the second largest component, coming in at 15.2%. And then from this particular graph, which is showing food waste generation, we can see that since the about 1980s, that the amount of food waste generated in the US has been increasing. Now, when we look at the municipal solid waste that was actually sent to the landfill to be disposed of, we can see that food waste here made up the largest percentage at 22%. However, I would like to point out that more and more states, they're starting to ban food waste from actually entering into the landfill. So you have methods like composting and energy recovery methods, such as anaerobic digestion, are being increasingly used to handle that food waste. So if we are diverting that food waste from going to the landfill, Not only are we saving space in the landfill, but we are also decreasing methane emissions that escape into the atmosphere. All right, so we have our wastewater treatment plant. So we can have anaerobic digestion to occur here to treat those sewage solids. So that's just those solids that are left over after the wastewater treatment process. So pictured here is DC Water, located in Washington, DC. And what you're looking at here is their thermal hydrolysis and anaerobic digestion project. So with this particular system here, they use a pre-treatment step called thermal hydrolysis. And within thermal hydrolysis, it takes those sewage solids and it operates under high temperature and high pressure, and it sterilizes those sewage solids and it makes that organic material more accessible for those microbes to break down that material within the anaerobic digester. So the biogas that's actually produced here, they use that biogas to generate electricity. And they produce enough electricity to power about a third of their facility. So actually in 2015, when this facility was commissioned, it was the largest advanced wastewater treatment facility in the world. And now we have our agricultural digesters. So say instead of allowing that biogas to escape into the atmosphere and contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, farmers are actually being encouraged to use anaerobic digestion technology to capture that methane and use it as a renewable form of energy. So these agricultural digesters often use manures such as dairy, poultry, and swine, and they also use crop residues as their digestion feedstocks. Now, I actually spent my graduate studies at the University of Maryland conducting digestion research at a USDA dairy farm, so I am most familiar with these dairy manure-based digesters. So when we think about the biogas that has been produced, you can see from this graph here that there are multiple ways in which that biogas can be used. Now, most often at livestock facilities, it's used for combined heat and power, followed by electricity generation. Now, with these combined heat and power projects, it uses that biogas to not only generate electricity, but that excess heat that's produced from electricity generation, they use that excess heat in order to, say, heat buildings as well as to heat their digester. Okay, so let's kind of look at the science, those microbial processes that are occurring in our anaerobic digester as we're breaking down that organic material and creating that methane-enriched biogas. So remember, lots of organisms, microorganisms are responsible. Lots of bacteria are involved in this process. So there are basically 4 major processes that are going to occur in anaerobic digestion. So you have hydrolysis, acidogenesis, acetogenesis, and methanogenesis. So here in hydrolysis, we have that complex organic matter. And that complex organic matter is going to be decomposed into your simple soluble compounds. And then in acetogenesis, we're going to get the formation of those volatile fatty acids from these simple soluble compounds. And then in acetogenesis, we're going to get the production of acetate, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide, which your methane forming organisms are going to need to produce that methane enriched biogas. So I would like to point out that there are additional benefits of using anaerobic digestion technology that go beyond the production of renewable energy in capturing that methane to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Another product of digestion is your effluent. So when you think about effluent, think about what comes out of the digester. So those are those undigested solids in those liquids. And post-digestion, those solids and those liquids, they can be separated. So with that liquid, it can be used as a liquid fertilizer. So this actually reduces the need to have to purchase those commercial fossil fuel-based fertilizers. Now, during your digestion process, those nutrients in your organic material, they become more readily available for plant uptake because those organic nutrients are getting converted to their inorganic forms. Now, I also mentioned that you have solids, and those solids can also be composted. So this can actually create a value-added product. So this can help you to generate a new revenue stream because these solids, since they can be composted, they can be sold as, say, potting media for plants. It can be reused as, say, bedding, or it can even be used as a soil amendment. And with a properly operating digester, it can also help to reduce those odors that are associated with the handling of liquid manures. So this can actually allow for homes and your farms to actually coexist together. And with digesters operating at elevated temperatures for an extended period of time, studies have shown that you're able to reduce pathogens such as E. coli as well as salmonella. All right, so we mentioned that this is a microbial-based process that is occurring. So the amount of biogas that is going to be produced is going to depend on several factors here. So not only is it going to depend on the characteristics of those organic waste materials that you're digesting, but also the operating parameters of the digester. So pH is going to play an important role. So the range, you usually want to keep your digester between, say, 6.5 and 8. You want a neutral pH. Now, I would like to point out that when you are digesting food waste, it can have its limitations. So sometimes food waste, especially that food that has like fruits and vegetables, if it has a high simple sugar content, that food waste can break down so rapidly that you get this accumulation of volatile fatty acids. And when you get those acids, it can cause the pH of the digester to actually drop. And when this pH drops, it can inhibit those methane-forming bacteria from producing methane. So that's why a lot of times you see manure placed into these agricultural digesters with food waste, because that manure helps to provide, say, a good buffering capacity to help try to resist those changes in pH in your digester. Now, when we're looking at the chemical composition of, well, I guess we could talk about temperature, but I didn't talk about temperature. So the rate that biogas is produced is also dependent on digestion temperature. So typically, your digesters are going to operate in either the mesophilic conditions or thermophilic conditions. And those thermophilic digesters, they operate at a higher temperature. So if we're generally speaking, the higher the temperature, the greater those microbial enzymatic activities. So that means that those reactions are occurring faster. You're getting faster methane production. Now, although you are getting faster methane production in these thermophilic digesters, research has shown that these thermophilic digesters are more sensitive to environmental changes. So these thermophilic digesters, research has shown they're not as stable in comparison to the mesophilic digester. And if we're going to look at the chemical composition of our biomass, again, remember those simple soluble organic compounds, those are, ideal for anaerobic digestion because they can break down quickly. Whereas if you have, say, feedstock that has like a high lignin or a high cellulose content, those tend to be more resistant to microbials or to microbes being able to break them down, and it may require a longer time to break that down in your digester. Okay, so we're going to look at some different designs of anaerobic digestion systems that are found at livestock facilities. So the most commonly used agricultural-based digesters consist of your covered lagoon, your plug flow digester, as well as a complete mix digester. Now remember, regardless of the design of your digester, those same microbial processes that are responsible for biogas production are still occurring. So this pie chart here is showing us the designs of operating digesters at U.S. livestock farms. So you can see most commonly used is the plug flow digester, followed by the complete mix, and then the covered lagoon. So we can look at the design and the operation of some of these common digesters. So we're going to talk about the covered lagoon digester first. And this is actually considered as the simplest design for an anaerobic digester because it consists of a lagoon, and that lagoon is sealed with a gas-tight flexible cover that captures the biogas. Now, oftentimes you will see that these are designed from a pre-existing manure lagoon that was already on site. And these particular digesters also operate at an ambient temperature. So since they are operating at ambient temperature, sometimes longer retention times are needed for digestion to occur, especially in colder climates. So these are definitely more suitable for operating in a warmer climate. And here we have our plug flow digester. So with our plug flow digester, this is just a horizontal, it's a long and narrow vessel. And this could be made from, say, concrete or steel. And that vessel is covered with a flexible material here. And that material captures the biogas. So how this particular digester operates, we want to make sure that it is fed at a constant rate. So that means every day we are putting in a plug of manure into our digester. And during the treatment process, that manure travels in plugs through the digester. So let's say, for example, in this particular example, that this digester has a 25-day retention time. So that means that the manure is held in this digester for 25 days. So if we would put a plug of manure into this digester on day 1, that means on day 25, it should be exiting out of the digester. So this is also considered a more simplified system because it involves few mechanical parts. So we're still talking about plug flow digesters. And this is another way that plug flow digesters can be built. So here we have some long and narrow flexible geomembrane bags that we have equipped with some biogas ports, some biogas pipes here. And these are pictures from a plug flow digester system that I assisted in building at Maryland at a USDA Agricultural Research Center. So since we were in Maryland, it was a colder climate. So these digester bags here were actually placed inside of these culverts to provide some additional installation. In each of these digesters, it also it was equipped with heating elements. So it had a kettle as well as this radiant piping here. So that kettle was used to heat up that manure prior to it going into the digester. And then we had this radiant piping here that contained a heated glycol solution. So as our bags were placed inside of the digester, from that heat, we were able to maintain a heated conditions within our particular digester. And you can see here, this is where our biogas came out, and it went to the shed in order to record how much biogas was produced. So again, we were in a colder climate, and oftentimes in colder climates, you will see these systems built within the ground. But for ease of maintenance and operation, since we were doing research, we chose to go with this particular culvert design instead. And here we have our complete mixed digestion system. So in comparison to that covered lagoon and that plug flow digester, this complete mixed system is usually associated with higher operating costs. And this is due to that where this system is equipped with heating as well as mixing elements. So by mixing, you're mixing up those organic materials, it's increasing the contact time that it has with the microbes. And it also helps to minimize the settling of your materials at the bottom of the digester. So you can see here that the mixing was achieved by, say, using some sort of paddles or agitating propellers, or you can say use a pump to help recirculate the material. And for heating, you could say use hot water piping or use heat exchangers here. And since we are using heating and mixing, that helps to increase biogas production by doing heating and mixing. So pictured here, these are some research pilot scale digesters, some complete mixed digesters that we designed for some studies at the USDA Agricultural Research Center. So our digesters, they were constructed from these polyethylene conical tanks, and we made sure to equip them with some silicone adhesive rubber heating blankets because we wanted to keep our digestion temperature around 35 degrees C. But we noticed that doing some of our experimental runs that we were losing heat. So that's why we built some of these reflective foil frames to place around our digesters to encapsulate that heat. And we also wired the digester's temperature control panel because we wanted to continuously monitor as well as control the digester's internal and external temperatures. So when that manure inside of the digester dropped below 35 degrees C, the heating blankets would turn back on. And then for mixing, you can see that in order to try to minimize settling in our digester, we made these stirrers with a top-mounted stir. We used the gear motor. And then we had these custom-made steel rods to help to stir the contents of our digester. Now, our tanks, they really couldn't take much pressure. So we had, in order to collect that gas, we decided to design a separate biogas collection system using these 1,000-liter plastic bags. And we installed these biogas collection ports on them that we made. And if you recall, I mentioned that biogas, it can contain water vapor. So in order to reduce some of that excess water vapor from entering into our bags, we also fabricated these moisture traps as well as desiccant traps to try to reduce some of that water in the biogas. And this is what our finished product looked like. So how our research digesters worked, we would pump the manure up from the bottom through this bottom port here. And then on each of our digesters, we had installed a water sampling port. And that port allowed us to be able to measure things like pH or volatile fatty acids. And as the gas was produced in the digester, it exited here out of this biogas collection port. And here you can notice is where we were able to take biogas samples directly from the digester so that we could measure how much methane was in our biogas. And then the biogas flowed out of the digester, But before it went into our biogas collection bags, it came down here to this moisture trap to collect some of that water, and then it flowed through the desiccant trap. And you can kind of see here down at the bottom, there's some discoloration here. So periodically, we had to change out that desiccant as it was wet, so that we could change out this desiccant so it could have greater drying capacity for the biogas. All right, so I know we've been talking about a lot of different designs of a digester. So I know you're probably thinking, okay, well, why would I choose one design over another? So just generally speaking, it's based on how your manure is collected at your facility, as well as the total amount of solids that's in your manure. So let's say that you have use a scraper. You're scraping up that manure. So it's going to have a much higher solid content in comparison to, say, if you wash out the manure out of the barn with water. And so with our scrape system, we could use a complete mix system. But when you have those lower solids waste streams, you would use that covered lagoon. So AgStar is a, they actually track the operational status of agricultural digesters in the United States. And for those of you who are not familiar with AgStar, it is a program that is a collaborative effort that's between the US EPA and the USDA. So they actually encourage the use of anaerobic digestion technology, helping to reduce methane emissions in the livestock industry. So if we're looking at the current status of anaerobic digestion in the United States, as of September of 2020, there were 263 digesters operating on livestock farms. And the majority of these digesters were using dairy manure as their feedstock, followed by swine manure. In operation of all of these digesters, it was reported that it produced an equivalence of 1.4 million megawatt hours of electricity. Excuse me, megawatt hours of energy. Now, if we take a closer look at the status of anaerobic digesters operating on US farms, we can see that since about the 2000s here, we have seen a steady growth in anaerobic digestion technology, and it starts to stabilize. Now, one of the reasons that we have seen this stabilization and growth in anaerobic digestion technology is this due to a decrease in natural gas prices around this 2009 timeframe. And since the prices of natural gas were low, this meant that some anaerobic digestion projects were no longer economically viable, thus ceasing operations. However, it is expected to see new growth occur in anaerobic digestion technology, especially due to the renewable fuel standard, as well as due to more states are implementing food waste bans. And in 2020, there was a small bump up in the number of anaerobic digesters. We have an increase in the number with 6 newly operating digesters and 19 are under construction. And I also wanted to point out too that AgStar actually estimates that biogas projects are feasible at over 8,000 large-scale dairies and hog facilities. So if all of these digesters would come online, that would produce 16 million megawatt hours of energy per year. So, okay, we've said that there's growth, there's room for growth for anaerobic digestion. So someone may ask, okay, so is this, feasible for my farm? So if you're looking to know if this is feasible, take some of these factors into consideration. So look at farm size. So AgStar actually estimate that anaerobic digestion is technically viable when you have a farm with 500 plus dairy cows or 2,000 hogs. And this is because you want to make sure you have enough liquid manure to make that project viable. Now, I also want to point out that anaerobic digestion projects have been successful at much smaller facilities, especially if they co-digest. So what I mean by co-digest, that involves adding an additional feedstock to the manure. And so you want to make sure you have enough manure year round, that you're collecting it regularly, and that it has a low solid content. You want to make sure that it's free of bedding, straw. You don't want any of that material clogging up your digester piping. And then with the digester, when it's properly operating, it can produce a lot of biogas. So have you considered what you're going to do with this biogas? And do you have the time as well as the technical expertise to properly manage this digester? All right, so we've been talking about these different organic waste materials. So the amount of biogas production from these organic waste materials can vary. So this chart here is showing us biogas production of different materials. And you can see from this chart that manures have a much lower biogas yield in comparison to other materials like corn silage or fats and greases. So you may have a farmer to say, okay, well, I operate this smaller dairy. So can anaerobic digestion be really a viable option for me? So remember, I said yes through co-digestion. That meant adding another material to the dairy manure in order to increase biogas production. And this can be a possible solution for making anaerobic digestion technology viable for those small and mid-sized farmers who were once limited by their animal waste volume. So I've actually conducted research looking at ways of how we can increase biogas production of dairy manure digesters. And some of my research has focused on investigating forage radish cover crops and using them as a renewable source of energy, and using this cover crop as a co-feedstock to increase biogas production of these dairy manure digesters. So I know you're probably thinking, okay, what really led you to study digesting forage radish in your dairy digester? So there's actually has been increased interest among farmers in growing this forage radish, and they're growing it as a winter cover crop. And they're doing this to achieve multiple soil and environmental benefits. Now, typically with your forage radish, it's typically planted immediately after the corn silage is harvested in about mid-August. And this cover crop doesn't compete with food production because most dairy farms have traditionally left their fields bare after the corn silage was harvested. And this particular cover crop is attractive to farmers because not only does it help to increase crop yield, but it also suppresses early spring weeds. Now, traditionally, these cover crops, they would not be harvested because after several consecutive nights with temperatures below -6 degrees C, this forage radish would winter kill, typically in late December or January, and it would rapidly decay, leaving behind a clean and an enhanced seed bed. So for our research, we thought, could we possibly get another benefit from the radish by harvesting that above ground material prior to winter kill and using it as a feedstock in our dairy digester to increase biogas production? And we discovered through our research, yes, we could. So here we have our forage radish cover crop. And for our feedstock, we harvested this above ground biomass, which consisted of all of the shoot plus a small portion of the roots that extended above the soil surface. And so by us harvesting only this above ground biomass, those benefits of increased topsoil fertility and weed suppression, they still remained as that below ground root was left in the field to actually decay in the soil. And these are just some pictures of us harvesting that radish. So you can see that our radish crop was first mowed with a rotary mower, and we mowed it as close to ground level as practical, about 3 to 5 centimeters. And then that radish was forage chopped and blown into this wagon. And from this particular harvest, we were able to collect about 7,300 kilograms per acre of above ground biomass. And it's estimated that at least 55% of that whole plant, so that below ground root, actually remained in the field for decomposition. And here's our picture of just a closer look at how that radish looked after harvesting. And it should be noticed that radish has a high sulfur content. And sulfur can have an inhibitory effect on methane production. All right, so I'm going to briefly talk about some studies that we did. So we wanted to determine if co-digesting with radish could increase biogas yield. So we conducted 2 independent field trials, and we used our research pilot scale complete mixed digesters, and they were operated in batch mode. So what I mean by batch mode is that we put in our organic materials on day 1, and they were allowed to digest over a 35-day period. And here we have a bird's eye view of our experiment. So we have our 6 complete mixed digesters, and as the biogas was produced, it flowed over to our biogas collection bags. And we have our meters here in order to tell us how much biogas was produced from our digesters. All right, so from our 2 field trials, those digesters contained either manure only or a radish plus manure co-digestion mixture. And we used 2 different radish additions. In trial 1, we had a 27% radish addition, and in trial 2, we had a 13% radish addition. Now, from our lab studies, we were shown that by increasing the amount of radish, it increased methane production. But we decided to go with these smaller loadings of radish in the digester because, one, an existing digester that's digesting dairy manure, it may not have enough space to accommodate those larger additions of radish. And we also wanted to minimize putting some excess strain on our mixers. So if we look at our radish plus manure digester here and compare it relative to its manure only digester, you can see that there was a lag in the amount of methane that was produced. And this could be because it was either, say, inhibited by that sulfur content of the radish, or just a longer amount of time was needed to acclimate to digest that radish. Now, although these manure digesters during trial 1 and trial 2, even though they contain the same amount of manure, methane production was found to be significantly different between the 2, even when we normalized the data. So this meant that we couldn't really determine the effect of radish loading rate on methane production. However, what we did determine is that even when you put a small amount of radish in your digester, like 13%, that you're able to increase biogas production by 40%. So that was a positive finding. And so this is just showing you a graph of the amount of methane as well as hydrogen sulfide that was in our biogas. So during that initial digestion period, you can see we had elevated concentrations of hydrogen sulfide. However, it rapidly declined as our methane increased. So during peak biogas production, we were getting a high quality biogas. Greater than 67% methane was in our biogas. All right, so as we're wrapping up here, we've talked about co-digesting and we've talked about diversifying revenue streams. But these are some other business models that a livestock farm can use to make anaerobic digestion a viable technology. So instead of the farmer owning and operating the digester is owned and operated by a third party. So this means that the farmer can lease their land and the third party can construct and operate the digester. And the farmer could say pay a small amount of money towards the digester, as well as providing the manure for the digester. So with this particular model, it means that the farmer does not have to have the technical expertise. So it helps to lessen the risk for the farmer as that third party is responsible for operating the digester. And then another business model, we're looking at that centralized or that community digester. So if you have farms that are located within close proximity to each other, this model could be used and those farmers can share the installation and that operating cost of that digester. And those farmers could transport their waste off-site and bring it to this centralized digester. So the biogas industry, there's definitely room for growth. So if you're interested in exploring anaerobic digestion further, here are a few available resources to take into consideration. So remember I mentioned the AgStar program. They actually have a website, and this is a centralized repository that's devoted to anaerobic digestion technology. And you can also contact your local USDA NRCS office, and you can inquire about the EQUIP program. That's the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, as well as the USDA Rural Development Office for their REAP program. So the Rural Energy for America program. And this is so you can learn more about technical and financial assistance that can be provided for these digester projects. So thank you again for attending today's webinar, and I would greatly appreciate if you could take a few minutes and provide some feedback about today's webinar. You can either scan the QR code with your mobile device or use the website link that we will place in our chat box and complete a short survey for us. And next month, we will have a webinar discussing severe weather. So please join us by registering at go.illinois.edu/everydayenvironmentwebinars to register for that webinar. So we have a few minutes now. Are there any questions, Dwayne?
Thank you, Dr. Belle. That was very interesting. And yes, we do have several questions. And if anybody still has a question they'd like to ask, feel free to go ahead and put that into the chat box, but we will go ahead and ask the questions that we have. Some of these may have been addressed during the presentation, but I'll go ahead and ask them anyway. Okay, first question, how does manure get into the digester?
Yes, so manure, if you're thinking about some of these, the household digester, like in a developing country, they just may have a shovel that they shovel the manure in. Or with these larger scale systems, you have pumping operations that pumps that manure into the digester. And depending on how some of these digesters are built, just by gravity, the manure is able to flow into the digester.
Okay, the next question is, how much money is the average digester?
Yes, so if you recall, I mentioned that there are different designs of digesters and there's different complexities to these digesters. So the prices are drastically different, but they can range anywhere from say $500,000 for these larger scale digesters up to millions of dollars.
So not something you could just get at the local hardware store?
No, not at the local, not at the local Home Depot.
Okay, the next question is, and this, I think you had a slide that kind of showed this, but are there digester operations in Illinois?
Yes, there are operations in Illinois. For the ones that have voluntarily reported their operations, there are about 3 agricultural digesters operating on livestock farms in Illinois.
All right, the next question is, what makes the plug of manure travel down the plug flow digester?
So think about this. Remember I said that the manure is fed at a constant rate. So that means that each day we are putting a plug of manure into the digester. So if that first plug that we put into the digester, on day 2, we're adding another plug of manure to the digester. So each time you add another plug to the digester, it helps to push it down the length of the digester.
All right, next question. On average, how long does it take to start seeing profit from the initial outlay of funds?
Well, I will say this when we're talking about payback period. So with payback period, we've seen a range from anywhere from say 5 years to more than 20 years. But with the median, it's showing that it's been around 15 to 17 years is when they start to see the payback period.
For this next question, you addressed at least part of it, I think, but is it considered an expensive operation? And then a follow-up, can it be done with human waste?
So what was the first part of that question?
Is it considered an expensive operation?
Yes, it can be relatively considered an expensive operation. And actually, that is one of the biggest challenges to the adoption of anaerobic digestion technology is the cost. But I would like to, point out that those upfront costs can be offset by the revenue that is actually generated from the digester. So by say selling your electricity or selling your natural gas or even charging tipping fees. So let's say you have a food waste processing plant and they want to get rid of their food waste. They can actually bring that food waste to a digester, and that digester operator can charge a tipping fee for bringing that. So that's, one method of being able to offset some of those costs. And yes, you saw at the wastewater treatment plant that they were digesting those sewage solids at the wastewater treatment plant. And they were also using that thermal hydrolysis step, which was treating those sewage solids under high temperature and high pressure. And it had a clean biosolids after it left out of the digester.
Next question is, how does the burn efficiency and emissions of biogas compare to petroleum-based natural gas?
Well, if you think about this, when you burn biogas, it releases CO2. But when you have methane itself, natural gas itself, natural gas is made up of primarily methane. But with our biogas, it's made up of not only methane, but also trace amounts of other gases like H2S and ammonia, as well as a small percentage of carbon dioxide. But still, when you burn the biogas, it's still going to release CO2 from the burning of it.
Okay, we have 2 questions left. This next one is this process the same as used to produce milorganite, if I'm pronouncing that correctly?
I'm not exactly sure what that is.
Well, if the person that wrote that wants to put something in the chat box, while we're waiting for that, we'll go ahead for the next question. Have you seen the grind to energy digester tanks that U of I is using to take food waste to the Urbana-Champaign Sanitary District?
I've actually never seen them there, no.
All right, and we are getting a couple of questions. Does the government, local or federal, provide tax breaks for having digester technology?
So I will say that my area of expertise is actually the science that goes on inside of the digester, but I do know that there are federal and state incentives for biogas projects. So not only are there competitive grants programs available, as well as there are cost share agreements that can be done in order to install and operate your digester.
All right, that concludes our questions. Oh, wait a minute, we have one more that just came in. what is the overall impact for climate change to creating this methane and burning it?
So with the anaerobic digester, it's helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions because we are actually capturing that methane gas. And methane has a higher global warming potential in comparison to carbon dioxide. So the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is not as potent in comparison to the methane that gets released. So we're converting it over into carbon dioxide, but we're also capturing that methane and preventing it from escaping into the atmosphere. So we're helping to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions of a greenhouse gas that has a higher global warming potential.
And we have two comments on the Milorganite question. Milorganite is a commercially available organic soil additive. And another person wrote, it is processed human waste that is sold as organic fertilizer.
Okay, well, I'm not really sure if they use anaerobic digestion technology to produce it. I'm not sure. But thanks for giving me that information.
Okay. And that concludes our questions. And again, Dr. Bell, I want to thank you very much. Very informative presentation. And I'll let you have, if you have any concluding remarks, I'll let you do that. Otherwise, thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks again for attending. Have a great afternoon.